What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I am coming at you with an updated hand trap tier list for September. And there's a lot of stuff up in the air in the current format, like if maybe we ever get a ban list, possibly. That might change this a little bit, but as I've mentioned in some previous tier lists before, whenever that does happen, I plan on doing like a winners and losers for the ban list. So I do want to make an updated hand trap guide for September because my last one was early August or maybe even like late July, so it's about time to update it. And I'm just going to be going over all of like the relevant hand traps for the current format and how I sort of rank them. I do want to let you guys know, Discord link down below along with all of our other social media links if you want to follow the channel more closely. Also, I'm currently climbing the 10K ladder, so I'm trying to hit 20,000 subscribers by sometime next year. So if you do enjoy this video content, you want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out in what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's start ranking some hand traps. Alright, so quickly going over the tiers, we have the top category, which is meta, things you will more than likely find in your main or side. Strong picks, which are going to be, things you are likely to see in your main or side, but may not be in everyone's. Okay, but not the best options means they're like good if you want to play a lot of a certain type of hand trap, like maybe running like 9 effect veilers in the case of Mourner, but they're usually outclassed by other options. Then you have situational, which are for certain decks or against very certain matchups, and then not this format, which means they're just not playable right now. Starting off, we're going to start with Ash Blossom, who's definitely meta. This is like the most consistent hand trap in this tier. Obviously, Ash is very good. She's not super high impact, but she is like the best low impact hand trap possibly. So there's Ash. Cherries, I think, is interesting. I'm going to put her in situational because only like certain decks can really take advantage of Cherries, because you have to, one, have like the extra deck for it. Something like Fluandereeze or even potentially like Exosister might be able to do like take advantage of this card. Things where your extra deck isn't as important. Like Fluandereeze is the number one that comes to my mind initially. But it's very good in formats like this where like the top decks always have specific cards in their extra deck. One of the downsides of this that I think makes it less good than I had it in my last tier list is that the current iteration of Tier Element, even though it's probably the best deck, you think you could just hit Kalos or something in their extra deck and it would be fine, but the way they're playing it now with all the dangers and the way it combos, it doesn't actually need Kit Kalos to win. So I think Cherries finds itself in a really weird option, but I do think it is a situational hand trap that can be okay. Contact C, definitely not this format. It's just not very good right now. DD Crow, this is an interesting one. If you'd asked me, a couple months ago going into Power of the Elements, I would have put it in meta, and I do still think it's very good. But I might just be strong pick. No, I'm gonna put it in meta. So I do think if you're playing a deck with hand traps, like Crow is one of the best options because it is so good versus Tier Element, which is proving to be the strongest deck in the current format, and it's pretty good versus Sprite as well, hitting like Totally Awesome. You can hit the elf target, you can hit Ronin Totem, so it's overall a very strong hand trap. You don't see as much of it, I feel like, anymore, but that's not really because as a hand trap it's gotten less good. I feel like with the shift to board breakers, you see like hand traps in general less often, so it makes it seem like Crow's getting less play, but I think Crow is definitely easily categorized as a meta hand trap right now. Cycle Reader, not this format. Like Drytron is a good deck, but it's, the top decks are dark decks, so we really don't need a card like Cycle Reader. Droll is interesting. I'm gonna put it in okay, but not the best option. So like Droll, going into Power of the Elements initially, so a month ago, I was like, Droll is not good. It's just not going to be played. And 90% of cases that is true. However, like with Dangers becoming a lot more popular, I do think this card is better than it was initially. It's actually climbed up the hand trap ladder here, but still not good enough to be a strong pick. This does have matchups where it's pretty good. Like Exosister, it's good. Versus Rika, it's good. Versus Math Mech, it's like pretty mid. Like if you catch them on a Psynet though, or a Small World, they can't search Super Factorial, which is nice, but I still don't know if it's worth siding, but I think it's not wrong to play. Like if you have room in your side deck and you're finding success with this card, I don't think it's terrible, but I do think it's outclassed by a lot of other hand traps. Effect Veiler, I'm gonna put in meta. This, is it meta? I do feel like Veiler is getting chosen less than other hand traps as opposed to like something like Imperm, obviously, but I do think Valor is still very common to see in decks that are running a lot of hand traps. Gamma is a really interesting one because there was a point where it looked like this hand trap was going to be one of the best hand traps this format because it's so good versus Sprite, but I've actually seen it decline like a lot. Like a lot of lists I have not seen be playing Gamma. It's definitely there, it exists, but overall I'm going to put it in strong pick. I don't see it as often as you would think. It might be because like the way it interacts with Sprite and Gigantic, why it's not seeing enough play, or maybe decks aren't really, like, it's not that great versus Tier Element either is another problem. So I don't know, it's like okay versus Tier if you're able to hit a graveyard effect and then it was just like a different DD Crow. But like this one requires a brick, it takes more commitment. Now, as I've seen Gamma in Sprite a lot for emergency teleport, but I think that's more like as an extender, less as a hand trap. Of course you can use it as a hand trap, but if they weren't running E-Tele package, then a lot of Sprite that aren't playing E-Tele aren't playing Gamma. So it's mostly because it's doing double duty in those versions is the reason they play it. So I'm going to put Gamma in strong pick, but maybe not meta. I feel like I'm seeing this less often than these. Ghost Mourner, this is where I usually put this card in okay, but not the best option because Valor and Imperm exist and they are most of the time pretty like much better than Ghost Mourner in a lot of instances. But if you want to play like 9 effect Valors, then Mourner's like always a good option. If you're playing like 15 hand traps and you want like 3 Nibiru and 9 effect Valors, Mourner is an amazing card because she's just doing the additional job of Valor and Imperm. There are other reasons to play this card. It also is like a time win condition. It's not a bad card, but it's outclassed. It's like the definition of outclass, which is why it finds itself in this tier. Ghost Ogre, I'm going to put in strong pick. This is pretty solid, I would say. It's a very good card. It's good versus Sprite, like really good versus Sprite. It's good versus Rika because it can hit the field spell. It's good versus Pure Punk because it can hit the field spell. And it's also good versus, well, I don't want to say good. It's better than you would think against Tearlament because you can hit things like Redoer and Dragostapelia in the field spell. It's not terrible versus that deck, but it's not like amazing either. I do think this card is picking up steam, or at least I would hope so. I feel like in my list, I run this card more often now because it really is pretty good against what's currently in the meta. And if you ever play against Sprite with the Brave package, or any deck with the Brave package, this of course trades very good into the Brave engine. Infinite Impermanence, definitely meta. This is one of the best hand traps because it's also being played in the board breaker type decks where they're deciding to play board breaker instead of hand traps because Imperm sort of fits the role of both. Lancia, not this format. There's not any decks that are really banishing right now. Like you could say like Exosister, but they banish like on your turn, so you couldn't even use Lancia. There's just no reason to be playing Lancia in the current format. Nibiru is always an interesting one, and I think, me personally, Nibiru is meta. I know some people would argue that it's down here because it's not good versus like pure tier, and it's weird versus Sprite, but I feel like this card, if it's not in your main deck, should 100% be in your side deck. Nibiru has been getting increasingly better because tier has shifted away sort of from the pure variant with a lot of, you know, board breakers or hand traps, and they're playing a lot of dangers and extenders, and it's a really go hard combo deck. And Nibiru dominates that version of Tier Element. Like, a couple of people who have done really well at tournaments, like the winner of the Oceanic Nationals, said Nibiru was pretty much the best hand trap of his deck. I know there was a list going around that was playing Nibiru and 9 Effect Valors with Mourner in the deck, just to make sure Nibiru resolved against decks like Sprite, or any deck that could negate it, so any Punk variant with Baron. And this card really does dominate the format, especially if you pair it with one of these, right? Valor or Imperm. I think Nibiru is very strong because by itself, it can dominate the massive tier board. Like say they set up, I don't know, Griffin off of Curious that set like a Floodgate. They ended with Dweller, maybe a Kalos or a Kaleido Heart, and then you Nibiru them, it is tough, right? So yeah, I don't know, Nibiru is very good, and honestly, like, I think it could be a meta hand trap, and I'm placing it here because if it's not in your main, I think it should be in your side deck, and I think this is one of the biggest changes from my last tiered list. Phantasme, not this format. This card actually wouldn't be that terrible if it wasn't for Gigantic Sprite, but since Gigantic locks you out of summoning level 2 or higher, or anything that's not level 2, Phantasme is kind of weak. This is Flying? No, this is Retaliating Sea. This card is also not this format, kind of for the same reasons as Phantasme, like they might Gigantic you before they starter, and then this card is completely useless, and it's like, Not good versus tier because they don't really have any spells besides like polymerization that are actually summoning, so it's really hard to hit them with this. D-Shifter. Now, D-Shifter is interesting because it's the best hand trap that exists. Like, if your deck can play D-Shifter, you play D-Shifter because it's like way up here. It is the most impactful hand trap there is. But because only a couple of decks can play it, I'm going to put it in Situational, and it's only really good versus certain decks. Like, this card versus Tearlament is just pretty much game. If you're a deck that can play this, like Fluwandereeze, Exosister, like Grenmaju variants, even Sprite in the side deck, this card you want to be running. But it is, like, I know it's in Situational tier, but that's not because it's weak. It's up here. It's situational because it can only be played in some decks and versus some decks. Token Collector, not this format. Like, you could put it in situational, but I don't think that the Brave Engine or Sword Soul are popular enough to warrant play in either the side or main. If it's like a one of and you're playing Shooting Riser, you can definitely side like one of this, or you're playing Virtual World and you can dump it off Beatrice, you can side one, but overall I don't think it's worth playing. Ghost Bell, I think, is extremely good. I'm going to put Ghost Bell in strong picks. This card, essentially, I'm going to say is less good than Crow, although how much do I believe that? This is interesting because I do feel like Bell and Crow, you know, I'm going to put Bell up here. And this is more or less like, I think it's on par with Crow. Bell does things that Crow does not. Crow is better against tier generically because if they chain block one of their tier elements, you can still Crow it and it will not resolve. And Bell, you know, she gets sort of destroyed by your opponent chain blocking, right? However, Bell can hit a lot of really good things. It's more of a defensive card against your opponent's DD Crows, your opponent's Called by the Graves, your opponent's like Ice Dragon's Prison is the example I give a lot, even though that's not really being played right now. It also can hit Totally Awesome, which is definitely a huge benefit for Ghost Bell. And you know, it can hit things like Elf Effect, the same as Crow. Like, I feel like if you're putting Crow in meta, I feel like Bell should be right next to him, but I guess there's an argument to put Bell down here because these are being played more often than Bell, but I feel like that's almost an oversight because I feel like Bell is super good right now. Dogwood, this is a situational hand trap. I love it in decks that don't have either a time win condition or have a slow grindy like game plan, like Altergeist, Sky Striker, Dragon Maid, the new Labyrinth deck. I love this card in those decks when you're going to a premier event because the problem with those decks is they take forever to play. Like, the objective is to grind out your opponent and gain more resources, and sometimes your game one can last 30 minutes. So having a time win condition in Dogwood, in case like your opponent's slow playing you, or you know, it's really close to time, Dogwood is amazing in those situations. And then Skullmeister. Skullmeister's an interesting one to rank because he's not seeing any play at all, but technically he does the same thing as Crow or Bell. I'm going to put him in okay, but not the best option because by the definition of outclassed, that's really what Skullmeister is this format. He's outclassed by these cards, but technically he fills the same role. So if for whatever reason you don't have access to these, Skullmeister in theory could do the trick. Or if you needed to replace like a Crow or a Bell in your deck for a small world bridge and Skullmeister fits the mold, then you can definitely easily replace it there because he still at the end of the day is going to try to do what Bell and Crow do. And yeah, that's how we're going to tier these hand traps. I think it's pretty similar to my last tier list. Definitely a couple changes as the format has shifted. Normally, I think there would be more changes, but because the format for at least 3 weeks shifted definitely more to board breakers instead of hand traps, they haven't had the chance to really like evolve. Like, we're almost still in Power of the Elements because we didn't play hand traps for so long. I mean, decks still are favoring board breakers, but hand traps have definitely been coming back a little bit. And yeah, I think that they haven't had their chance to really evolve this format into where their real picks are, but I do think this is pretty accurate, and while it's not very different from the last format, you know, these hand traps are always generically pretty good. And yeah, that is going to be it for this hand trap tier list. Let me know down in the comments how you would tier this. Did I miss a hand trap? I always feel like I missed one hand trap, but I don't think any hand traps I missed are relevant, like No Material or like Engraver of the Mark. Those are not really relevant to list right now. But yeah, let me know how you guys would rank this tier list, what you think of this tier list, and if you did enjoy this video, leave a like and subscribe. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.